Subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. The bar was loud in the way only midnight could make it, music low and dangerous, laughter sharp, shadows stitched together by neon light. When he took the stool at the far end, the place people chose when they wanted to see everything without being seen. They called him many names in the city, whispered them into phones and pillows, but here he was just another man in a tailored suit with eyes that didn't blink enough. The bartender noticed him the moment he entered, not because of the money or the presents, she'd seen both before, but because the room subtly rearranged itself around him, conversations dimming, smiles tightening, as if the air knew him. She moved with practiced calm, pouring, wiping, nodding, while her mind raced through the small details that told her tonight was wrong. The man at table 3 watching the mirror instead of the room, the woman near the jukebox who kept checking her watch, the way the ice scoop trembled when she lifted it. When the Mafia boss ordered a simple drink, neat, no garnish, she felt the cold truth settle in her chest. She had seen the vial slip, had seen the hand that didn't belong to any friend she knew, and she understood that if he drank it, the night would end in blood and sirens. She made the drink anyway, because that's how survival worked here, and as she set the glass down she slid a folded napkin beneath it, her smile steady, her voice light, her heart pounding loud enough she was sure he could hear it. The napkin read, "Don't drink it. Smile and leave now." He read it without moving his head, eyes flicking down and back up, and for half a second she thought he would do exactly that, stand, tip, vanish, but instead his hand closed around her wrist, firm, controlled, not a threat yet but a promise, and the world narrowed to the heat of his grip and the question in his gaze. He smiled for the room, lifted the glass for show, then set it down untouched, leaning in just enough that only she could hear him. "Who told you to play games with me?" he murmured, voice calm as glass, and she swallowed, choosing honesty over fear because lies got people buried. She told him what she'd seen, not names, never names, but shapes and movements, and she felt his grip loosen as his mind moved faster than hers ever could, mapping exits, assigning consequences. Around them the bar kept breathing, unaware, while his men, invisible until they weren't, adjusted positions like chess pieces. He released her wrist and paid with a bill too large to be kind, then stood, nodding as if in thanks, and walked toward the door, the room exhaling behind him. She thought it was over until he paused, turned, and said, "You did the right thing," and the way he said it told her that right and safe were not the same. Outside, the night cracked open, an engine revved, a shout cut short, and she ducked instinctively, hands shaking as the door swung back, his silhouette filling it again, different now, sharper. "You're coming with me," he said, not asking, because the people who had tried to poison him wouldn't forgive witnesses, and because he'd seen something in her eyes he recognized, courage born from necessity. She protested, thinking of rent and routines and the small life she'd built, but the city had already decided otherwise. They moved through the alley where the trash smelled like secrets, into a car that hummed with restrained power, and as the door shut she realized that warning him hadn't saved her, it had changed her trajectory entirely. He didn't touch her again, not then, but his presence filled the space, questions hanging unasked, and as they pulled away she watched the bar's neon fade, wondering who she was now that she had crossed an invisible line. He spoke at last, telling her the city rewarded loyalty and punished courage without strategy, and that tonight had shown him both her flaws and her potential. Sirens wailed somewhere distant, and she thought of the napkin, the ink smudged by sweat, the moment that had split her life in two. When the car turned onto the river road, lights streaking like promises, she understood the truth beneath his calm. He hadn't let go because he couldn't afford to, and neither, it seemed, could she. The car carried them across the river road with a smooth inevitability, the city sliding past in reflective fragments, and she kept her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking, counting breaths the way she'd learned to do during long shifts when things got loud and ugly. He sat beside her without crowding her space, phone to his ear, issuing quiet instructions that sounded less like orders and more like conclusions already reached, addresses confirmed, exits secured, a doctor notified, while she realized that the night was unfolding on rails she couldn't see. When he ended the call, he studied her not like a threat but like a variable, and she bristled under the attention, forcing herself to meet his gaze because fear had never helped anyone survive him. He asked her name. She gave it, then gave nothing else, and he nodded as if that restraint pleased him. They arrived at a townhouse that blended into wealth the way predators blend into foliage, security opening without ceremony, and she was guided inside past art that felt expensive enough to be dangerous. He offered water, tea, space, choices presented plainly, and she chose water and a chair near a window, grounding herself with the weight of glass and the fact that the locks clicked behind them not as a warning but as protocol. He explained, calmly, that someone had tried to poison him at his favorite bar, that this meant a breach close to home, and that witnesses tended to disappear when the guilty panicked. His solution was temporary protection, and he spoke the word temporary with a precision that made her believe it might be true. She challenged him, surprising herself, asking why he should be trusted when the city trembled at his name, and he answered with a story about debts and leverage and the difference between chaos and control, never claiming goodness, only order. As the minutes stretched, the adrenaline drained, leaving exhaustion in its wake, and she confessed the practical fears, her job, her apartment, the cat she'd left fed but alone, and he listened, then delegated solutions with a few texts that felt too easy, too final. A housekeeper appeared with a guest room prepared, clothes borrowed in her size, and she felt the uncanny slip of identity that came from wearing something not hers. Later, when sleep refused her, she wandered into the kitchen to find him there, sleeves rolled, pouring coffee like a man trying to remember normalcy, and they talked in low voices about how people learn to read rooms, how survival sharpens senses, how courage looks ordinary when it's routine. He admitted he'd seen the vial too late, that her note had interrupted a chain reaction, and that grabbing her wrist had been instinct, not threat, a reflex to anchor the one piece of the room that mattered. She told him about the mirror watcher and the woman with the watch, about the way danger leaves fingerprints, and he filed the details away, gratitude expressed without softness. By dawn, the townhouse hummed with quiet activity, reports coming in, suspects narrowing, and he told her the bar would be closed for a few days, officially for repairs, and officially to let the city breathe. When news broke of a man found sick but alive near the docks, a courier who'd handled something he shouldn't have, she understood that the line between mercy and message was thinner than she'd imagined. He offered her a choice then, real this time: return to her life with security shadowing her until things cooled, or stay longer and help him read rooms she knew better than his men ever could. The offer unsettled her because it sounded like opportunity wrapped in danger, and because some part of her wanted to say yes, not to him, but to the idea that her instincts mattered. She asked for time, and he gave her a day, a rare pause in a world built on momentum. Standing by the window as sunlight climbed the river, she weighed the cost of going back against the price of staying, aware that whatever she chose, the napkin had already written her into a story that wouldn't forget her name. By the time afternoon settled into the townhouse like a held breath, she had made her decision not with certainty but with resolve, the kind that forms when you stop asking what's safe and start asking what's honest, and when she told him she would stay, for now, he accepted it with a nod that carried neither triumph nor relief, only the steady recalibration of plans. He set boundaries immediately, which surprised her. She would observe, not interrogate, advise, not decide, and at any point she could leave with protection intact, no strings, no debts spoken aloud. The structure soothed her nerves, and she found herself stepping into the rhythm of the place, learning names, noticing patterns, understanding how a house like this functioned as a living organism with rules that mattered. He introduced her to his operations chief, a woman with sharp eyes and a softer voice than expected, who explained how they tracked movement without being seen and how information was weighed like currency, never spent all at once. In the evening they reviewed the bar incident with a careful neutrality, photos and timestamps laid out, and when she pointed to the mirror watcher and explained the way his attention avoided faces, there was a murmur of agreement, the first time she felt not like a guest but a contributor. Later, over a quiet dinner that tasted better than it should have, he asked about her life before the bar, about the choices that led her there, and she told him pieces without polishing them, aware that in his world truth mattered less than consistency. He shared little in return, but what he did offer carried weight. A childhood shaped by scarcity, a mentor who taught him that power without discipline collapses, a single mistake years ago that taught him the cost of trusting the wrong smile. The conversation drifted to silence, comfortable in a way she didn't expect, until alarms hummed, not loud, just present, and the house shifted gears. A vehicle had been tailing the perimeter, testing response time, and she watched the choreography of prevention unfold, impressed by the absence of panic. He asked her to watch the live feed and tell him what she saw beyond the obvious, and she focused on the driver's posture, the hesitation at the turn, the telltale pause before a decision, offering insights that led to a clean intercept with no confrontation. When it was done, he thanked her plainly, and something unspoken settled between them, a recognition that went beyond the night's crisis. As days layered atop one another, she learned the cadence of his mornings, early calls, quiet exercise, black coffee, and the way he loosened in the evenings, music low, windows cracked to let the city breathe. She began training sessions that sharpened her instincts into tools. Situational awareness refined, exit mapping practiced, the difference between threat and noise drilled until it felt like a language she'd always spoken. Through it all, he remained careful, respectful of space, but present, and she noticed how his restraint was as deliberate as any command. Trouble came not as an explosion but as a whisper, a leak in a secondary channel, a trusted intermediary asking the wrong questions, and she recognized the shift before the data confirmed it, the subtle change in tone that precedes betrayal. She warned him, and this time he listened first, acting second, rerouting operations to expose the leak without tipping his hand. The plan worked, catching a mid-level fixer who'd grown greedy, and the fallout was contained, but the lesson lingered. Intuition mattered, but only when paired with patience. One night, after a close call that ended with a tense standoff resolved by words rather than force, she found herself shaking in the quiet aftermath, the delayed fear crashing through her resolve. He noticed, offered tea, sat across from her without filling the space, and spoke about the cost of vigilance, about how strength erodes when you pretend you don't feel it. She confessed that staying scared her as much as leaving, that the city felt different now, sharper, and he admitted that letting someone close to the machinery of his life was a risk he didn't take lightly. Their honesty didn't blur lines, it clarified them, and when she went to bed that night, sleep came easier than it had since the napkin changed everything. The next morning brought news that the source of the poison had been traced back to a rival trying to send a message without starting a war, and as the response was planned with measured restraint, she understood that this world survived not on explosions but on choices made in the quiet. Standing by the window again, watching the river carry reflections downstream, she realized that she was no longer just reacting to danger, she was learning how to shape outcomes, and that whatever came next, she would meet it with eyes open, hands steady, and the knowledge that not letting go sometimes meant holding on to who you were becoming. The city responded to the contained fallout the way it always did to unseen pressure, by pretending nothing had changed while subtly adjusting its posture, and she felt it in the quieter streets, the pauses in conversations that resumed too quickly, the way people glanced at corners before committing to smiles. Inside the townhouse, planning replaced reaction, and he invited her into meetings not as ornament but as counterweight, asking where tension would surface, who would flinch first, which public spaces would absorb disruption without spilling it into chaos. She learned the art of controlled absence, how sometimes the most powerful move was to not appear at all, and she watched him orchestrate calm by choosing restraint over spectacle, a discipline that surprised even his own people. One afternoon he took her to a nondescript cafe miles from the river, explaining that power learned humility by traveling light, and there he showed her how he listened more than he spoke, letting others reveal themselves through impatience or bravado. When a courier dropped a note meant for someone else and apologized too much, she caught the tremor and murmured it to him. He adjusted his schedule, and a planned ambush dissolved into nothing because the target never arrived. As trust grew, so did the tests, subtle and fair, and she passed them not by brilliance but by consistency, by being exactly who she said she was even when no one was watching. In quieter moments, they talked about ordinary things, music that made long drives tolerable, foods that tasted like home, the strange comfort of routine, and she saw how he curated normalcy as carefully as he managed risk. Yet danger pressed in from angles no map could fully predict, and when a charity gala became the chosen stage for a rival's posturing, he asked her to attend, not as bait but as lens, to read the room where influence wore tuxedos and threats hid behind champagne flutes. The night shimmered with politeness sharpened into knives, and she navigated it with the same instincts that once guided her behind the bar, noting who lingered too long near exits, who laughed without humor, who touched glasses they didn't drink from. She warned him mid-event of a shift in energy, a tightening around a particular donor whose generosity felt performative, and he altered his route, diffusing tension with a brief public appearance and an early exit that denied the rival their audience. Back at the townhouse, the relief was tempered by a realization. Someone had tested her as much as him, measuring her influence by watching his response, and the implication unsettled her more than the threat itself. He addressed it directly, acknowledging that proximity carried visibility, and asked if she still wished to stay, reminding her, again, that leaving would not be punished. She stayed, but not without conditions of her own. Transparency where it concerned her safety, a voice when her name entered rooms she wasn't in, and the freedom to say no without consequence. He agreed without negotiation, and the pact felt like a hinge moment, the point where survival evolved into partnership. Weeks passed, layered with training and planning, and she found herself less reactive, more deliberate, understanding how patience could be weaponized for good as well as ill. Then the city pushed back harder, a coordinated attempt to destabilize supply lines without fingerprints, and she recognized the pattern from years of watching nights go bad all at once, the false emergencies, the misdirection, the way fear multiplied itself if left unattended. She suggested a counterintuitive response. Visible generosity paired with invisible firmness, flooding the city with stability while quietly sealing leaks, and he trusted her enough to try it. The effect was immediate and strange, the tension easing not because danger vanished but because uncertainty did, and the rival's gambit lost momentum. In the aftermath, exhaustion found her, a deep weariness that settled into her bones, and one evening she admitted she missed the simplicity of pouring drinks and going home, the boundaries that had once felt like walls now remembered as anchors. He listened, then surprised her by closing a laptop and suggesting a day off, a real one, no agendas, no shadows. They drove beyond the city's edge where the air smelled different, walked along a quiet stretch of water, and for a few hours she forgot to scan for exits, laughing at nothing in particular, feeling human again. On the drive back, he spoke of the future not as conquest but as maintenance, of keeping things from breaking, and she realized that his power lay less in taking than in preserving. That night, a message arrived confirming the rival had backed down, choosing a truce over escalation, and as plans shifted from defense to consolidation, she felt the weight of what they had avoided. Standing on the balcony later, lights flickering like distant constellations, she acknowledged the truth she'd been circling. She was no longer here by accident, and leaving would require as much courage as staying. He joined her without comment, the city stretching between them, and though neither spoke of what lay ahead, the silence carried a shared understanding that whatever came next would be met not with panic, but with intention, and that sometimes not letting go meant choosing, again and again, to remain present when the easier path was to disappear. By the time the truce settled into the city's bloodstream, subtle and unannounced, she had learned that peace in this world was not an absence of danger but a managed equilibrium, and maintaining it required vigilance sharpened by empathy, a balance she was only beginning to master. The townhouse grew quieter, not empty but purposeful, as teams shifted from defense to consolidation, and he tasked her with an unusual role, auditing perception rather than operations, mapping how their recent choices were being interpreted across neighborhoods that felt consequences long before they saw causes. She walked markets and cafes with a low-profile escort she barely noticed anymore, listening to the cadence of complaints and gratitude, noting where rumors clotted and where trust flowed, and she reported back not in numbers but in stories that captured tone and tempo. He absorbed it all with a seriousness that treated her observations as infrastructure, adjusting outreach here, tightening discipline there, and she realized that power refined by listening could become something close to stewardship. Trouble, when it returned, did so wearing civility, a delegation seeking partnership that sounded too eager, their smiles rehearsed, their questions circling her name in ways that felt like reconnaissance. She flagged it, and he responded by placing her in the room deliberately, not as shield but as signal, watching how the delegation recalibrated when faced with the person they'd been whispering about. The meeting unfolded with polite sparring, and she noticed the micro-failures, the way one delegate interrupted another, the slight impatience when boundaries were restated, and she spoke once, clearly, reframing the conversation around mutual obligations rather than gains. The shift was immediate, leverage realigned, and the delegation left with less than they wanted and more than they expected. The partnership narrowed to terms that favored stability over ambition. Later, he acknowledged that her presence had altered the outcome, not because of intimidation but because authenticity disrupted their script, and she felt a quiet pride that surprised her with its steadiness. As days shortened and evenings grew colder, fatigue crept in, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it frays your temper, and one night she snapped at a minor oversight, then apologized, unsettled by the version of herself that surfaced under strain. He didn't chastise or soothe, he redirected, reminding her that erosion happened fastest when people forgot to rest, and he mandated rotations and recovery not just for her but for his entire team, an act of leadership that drew loyalty more effectively than fear ever could. The city tested the truce again with a sudden, unrelated crisis, a fire in a warehouse tied to no one they knew, and she helped coordinate relief quietly, understanding that credibility was built in moments where no credit was claimed. When gratitude reached them anyway, uninvited and sincere, she understood the long game he'd been playing all along, legitimacy earned through consistency, not spectacle. Yet shadows lingered, and she sensed them in the way her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number that never left a message, in the feeling of being watched without hostility, and she told him, not alarmed but alert. He investigated without dramatics and uncovered a private investigator hired not to harm but to observe, a relic of the rival's caution, and instead of retaliating he sent a message of boundaries so clear it ended the surveillance without humiliation. The restraint impressed her, and she asked him once, in a rare moment of candor, whether he ever wanted more territory, more recognition, and he answered that expansion without purpose hollowed people out, that he measured success by how little blood the city required to keep moving. The answer stayed with her when an opportunity arose that tested their pact. A civic committee invited her to advise on nightlife safety, a role that would pull her into public view, complicating anonymity and inviting scrutiny. She brought it to him expecting concern, perhaps refusal, but he surprised her by encouraging it, outlining safeguards and contingency plans while insisting the choice remain hers. She accepted, stepping into a room far removed from the bar that had shaped her instincts, translating hard-earned lessons into policies that prioritized prevention over punishment. The work energized her, and she felt her identity expanding rather than splitting, the bartender and the advisor reconciling into something whole. Inevitably, criticism followed, whispers that she was a proxy, a plant, and the old fear flared, but she faced it head-on with transparency, answering questions plainly, refusing to be baited into defensiveness. He watched from a distance, intervening only once to shield her from a manufactured scandal that evaporated under scrutiny, and afterward he thanked her for holding the line without compromising herself. One evening, after a long session drafting guidelines that would outlast any single administration, she returned to the townhouse drained but fulfilled, finding him on the balcony with the city laid out like a promise kept. They spoke of thresholds, how crossing one changed you, how the fear of crossing back could be just as paralyzing, and she admitted that staying had given her more than safety, it had given her a voice she hadn't known she was allowed to use. He told her that voices like hers were rare because they chose courage without craving control, and the acknowledgement felt like a benediction. As winter pressed closer, plans formed for the months ahead, quieter now, steadier, and she sensed that the story she'd fallen into was shifting chapters, from survival to stewardship, from reaction to intention. Standing there with the city humming below, she understood that not letting go had never been about his grip on her wrist, it had been about her decision to keep hold of her principles while learning how to wield influence without losing herself, a balance she was finally ready to defend. Winter arrived with a clarity that stripped the city to essentials, and in the sharper air she found her thinking sharpened too, priorities lining up as neatly as breath in the cold. The civic committee work expanded from guidelines into pilots, and she spent days walking venues with owners and staff, translating theory into practice, noticing how small changes, lighting angles, staff positioning, clearer exits, shifted energy before trouble could form. Each night she returned to the townhouse with notes that mattered, and he listened, absorbing the lessons not as charity but as strategy, recognizing that safety created loyalty more durable than fear. Yet the season carried its own tests, and when a sudden power outage rolled through 3 neighborhoods at once, rumors bloomed faster than facts, old tensions seeking a spark. She felt the familiar prickle and alerted him before the feeds caught up, and together they coordinated a response that blended public reassurance with private readiness, crews dispatched to support shelters while his teams quietly deterred opportunists. The city steadied, and the quiet success reinforced a truth she was learning to trust. Prevention was not passive, it was active restraint applied early. The balance wobbled when an internal audit revealed a lapse, a junior operative cutting corners, not malicious but careless, and she advocated for correction over punishment, a stance that risked appearing soft. He weighed it, then chose mentorship paired with accountability, and the outcome rippled through the organization, tightening standards while preserving morale. Watching it unfold, she understood leadership as a series of measured mercies that preserved strength for moments when mercy would not suffice. Their proximity deepened without crossing lines, a closeness built on mutual respect and shared silence, and she noticed how he watched her work with the same attentiveness he gave a city map, not possessive but invested. The unspoken question lingered, what happened when the work no longer required her here, and she answered it by not answering, focusing instead on the present tasks that demanded her whole attention. Trouble returned wearing patience. a long-term play by a distant syndicate probing the edges, offering generous terms that concealed a slow bleed of autonomy. She sensed the trap in the language, the way concessions were framed as conveniences, and she helped draft a response that appeared receptive while setting conditions impossible to exploit. Weeks passed as negotiations dragged, the city unaware of the chess match beneath its routines, and when the syndicate withdrew, choosing easier prey, the victory felt anticlimactic, which she learned was the point. The work took a toll nonetheless, and one night she woke from a dream of neon and ink-stained napkins with her heart racing, the old moment replaying with sharper edges. He heard her pacing and didn't intrude, leaving tea by the door and a note that said only, "You're not alone." The simplicity grounded her, reminding her that support didn't always need words. As the year turned, an opportunity arose that threatened the equilibrium they'd built. A national task force requested testimony from nightlife professionals, a platform that could amplify her work but also expose connections she'd kept deliberately blurred. She brought the invitation to him with a mix of excitement and dread, and he surprised her again by advising caution without discouragement, laying out risks and protections, insisting the decision remain hers. She chose to testify with boundaries intact, focusing on systems rather than stories, and the hearing passed without incident, her credibility strengthened by restraint. Back home, the townhouse hummed with quiet approval, and he acknowledged the trust she'd earned not with praise but with responsibility, asking her to help design a permanent unit dedicated to early warning and de-escalation. The ask felt like a culmination, and she accepted with conditions that mirrored those she'd set before: transparency, consent, the freedom to step back, and he agreed, sealing the role with a handshake that felt ceremonial. Spring teased the edges of winter, light lingering longer, and with it came a sense of renewal tempered by vigilance. The unit launched quietly, its success measured in nights that ended uneventfully, and she learned to value invisibility as proof of effectiveness. In rare moments of ease, they shared laughter over small absurdities, the city's contradictions laid bare, and she felt the weight she'd been carrying redistribute itself, less burden than purpose. When a final test arrived, a coordinated attempt to provoke a public incident during a crowded festival, she led the response with calm authority, rerouting foot traffic, adjusting schedules, deploying empathy alongside enforcement, and the night ended with music fading into satisfied fatigue rather than sirens. As dawn broke, he met her on the balcony, pride evident but restrained, and said simply that the city was safer because she had chosen to stay. She corrected him gently, saying the city was safer because people had chosen to listen, and in that exchange she recognized how far they'd come from a folded napkin and a reflexive grip. Not letting go, she realized, had transformed from an act of survival into a philosophy of care, one she was ready to carry forward, here or anywhere, because it lived not in a place or a person, but in the choices she made when it mattered most. As spring settled fully into the city, color returning to streets that had endured winter's discipline, the work shifted from building to sustaining, a phase she found both satisfying and deceptively fragile. The early warning unit matured into a quiet backbone, its success measured by the absence of headlines, and she spent long days refining protocols, training new liaisons drawn from neighborhoods that had once felt invisible to power. Trust grew in increments, earned by showing up consistently, by admitting mistakes early, by fixing what could be fixed without fanfare. He remained a steady presence, increasingly content to let systems carry weight rather than personalities, and she watched him step back in small, deliberate ways, creating space for others to lead. The shift brought its own tensions. Some within the organization bristled at the diffusion of authority, mistaking restraint for weakness, and she felt the undercurrent before it surfaced in meetings where voices sharpened and patience thinned. She named it without accusation, reframing the conversation around outcomes rather than ego, and the recalibration held, though she knew such balances required constant attention. Outside, the city tested boundaries with the return of festivals and late nights, and she navigated them with a confidence that felt earned, not borrowed, trusting teams to execute while she focused on pattern recognition rather than micromanagement. Then a personal thread arrived, subtle and intimate, a message referencing her past with enough detail to prove access, not violent but invasive, a reminder that visibility carried costs. She reported it immediately, refusing to normalize fear, and the response was swift but measured, protective without escalation. He checked in once, privately, offering support without pressure, and she appreciated the respect implicit in not making decisions for her. The investigation traced the message to a fringe actor seeking notoriety, neutralized through exposure rather than force, and the episode reinforced her commitment to transparency as a shield. Yet the incident stirred questions she'd deferred too long. How long could she sustain this pace, and what shape did she want her life to take when crisis no longer dictated its contours? She raised the topic one evening as they shared a rare unguarded meal, acknowledging the possibility of an endpoint without framing it as an exit. He listened, then spoke of succession as responsibility, not retreat, of building futures that didn't require constant vigilance from the same people. They sketched possibilities on paper like architects of an unseen bridge, options that preserved continuity while allowing personal growth. The city presented a proving ground sooner than expected when a heat wave strained infrastructure and tempers alike, creating conditions ripe for flashpoints. She coordinated with public services, leveraging the unit's relationships to keep water flowing, cooling centers staffed, misinformation corrected, and the nights passed with fewer incidents than forecasts predicted. The success drew attention from outside the city, inquiries about replicating the model, and she felt the pull of broader impact tug at her resolve. He encouraged exploration without urgency, reminding her that expansion done wrong replicated harm, and she agreed, advocating for pilot programs led by local partners rather than centralized control. The philosophy held, and invitations multiplied without overwhelming the work at home. Amid the momentum, a final internal challenge surfaced, an ambitious lieutenant pushing for a more aggressive posture to capitalize on perceived weakness elsewhere. The proposal promised growth but threatened the equilibrium she'd helped cultivate, and she argued against it with evidence and empathy, acknowledging fear while countering it with facts. He sided with her publicly, a decisive moment that clarified values for everyone watching, and the lieutenant accepted the decision, chastened but retained, mentorship replacing rivalry. The aftermath felt like a release, and in the quieter days that followed, she took her first real break in months, visiting the bar that had been her anchor before the night everything changed. It had reopened with new lighting and protocols she'd helped design, the mirror gleaming not as a warning but as a tool, and as she sat at the counter with a soda, she felt gratitude rather than nostalgia. When he joined her later, unannounced and unguarded, they shared a look that carried the weight of shared history without clinging to it. They spoke of endings and beginnings as overlapping circles, of knowing when to step forward and when to step aside, and she realized that whatever she chose next, it would be chosen, not compelled. The city hummed around them, alive and imperfect, and she felt a quiet certainty settle in, that not letting go had taught her how to build, and that building, done right, eventually made room for letting go without loss. The decision, when it came, arrived not as a rupture but as a convergence, the kind that forms when many small truths finally align, and she recognized it one clear morning as sunlight pooled on the river and the city moved with the easy confidence of something well tended. The early warning unit had leaders of its own now, people she trusted not because they mirrored her instincts but because they had honed their own, and the systems she'd helped design functioned without her constant presence. She met with the civic committee one last time as lead advisor, transitioning responsibilities with care, leaving behind documentation and relationships rather than empty titles. When she told him she was ready to step into a broader role, consulting across cities, building frameworks that could be adapted without imposing control, he listened without surprise, pride flickering briefly before settling into resolve. They planned the handoff together, timelines clear, protections intact, a demonstration of how endings could be as disciplined as beginnings. The city marked the shift quietly, nights continuing without spectacle, and she took comfort in the absence of drama as proof of success. On her final week, she walked the routes she'd learned to read by heart, noting the small signs of resilience, staff who intervened early, patrons who looked out for one another, spaces designed to calm rather than inflame. She returned to the townhouse to pack with a sense of gratitude rather than escape, folding borrowed clothes that no longer felt borrowed, pausing over the balcony where so many conversations had found their center. He joined her there one last time in the same quiet way he always had, and they spoke of the work ahead, of cities as ecosystems that thrived when listened to, of power measured by what it chose not to do. There were no promises that pretended distance wouldn't matter, only an understanding that respect endured when maintained. On the evening of her departure, the bar hosted a soft reopening event to celebrate a year without incident, and she attended not as a figure of authority but as someone who belonged, watching from the edges as laughter rose without edge. When the music faded, she stepped outside to find him waiting, not to escort but to witness, and they shared a moment that honored what had been without trying to preserve it unchanged. The car ride to the station was quiet, the city lights familiar and newly distant, and as they parted, his parting words were practical, contacts to call, resources to use, care expressed through preparedness. Her train pulled away with a gentle inevitability, and she watched the skyline recede, not with loss but with appreciation, understanding that she carried the city's lessons with her. In the months that followed, she worked in places that felt different but shared the same undercurrents, adapting principles rather than exporting solutions, listening first, acting with restraint, teaching others how to read rooms before they burned. The story of the napkin became a footnote she shared only when useful, a reminder that courage could be quiet and still decisive. Occasionally, updates arrived from the city, successes, challenges met without panic, and she responded when asked, advising without hovering, proud of a system that no longer needed her. One evening, at a conference far from the river, she found herself behind a bar again, helping a tired staff manage a surge, instincts humming, and she smiled at the continuity of it all. Later, as she walked back to her hotel, she reflected on the truth she'd learned. Not letting go had never been about possession or fear, but about commitment, to people, to principles, to the patience required to make change stick. Somewhere, the city continued to breathe, safer in ways that would never make headlines, and she felt connected to it without being bound. The ending, she realized, wasn't an ending at all, but a widening, a circle drawn large enough to include departure without erasure, and as she stepped into her next chapter, she carried with her the steady knowledge that the moment she slipped a warning instead of a drink had taught her how to choose, again and again, the kind of power that protects by listening, and the courage to release it when the time is right.